That's the central sulcus. Now for the gyri, there's one in front and one in back. So a ridge in front of the central sulcus, a ridge in the back of the central sulcus. This one in front is called the precentral gyrus, because it's right in front of the central sulcus. So that's this one. So it'll be light pink on the less bright green. And then this purple one that's right behind the central sulcus, that's the post-central gyrus. And it'll be kind of a light blue on the not so bright green. Now both of those have other names that we're going to learn in a couple minutes, so I'm going to write them down now so that you can recognize them when you see them. So the precentral gyrus is the same exact thing as what we call the primary motor cortex. And the post-central gyrus is the same thing as the primary sensory cortex. So that could be a question. If I point to the precentral gyrus and I don't say anything, you could call it either one of those and they would be right. But I might say, what's another name for the precentral gyrus? Or what's another name for the primary motor cortex? And then you'd have to tell me the other name for it. Okay, the fissures, these are really deep sulci, so just big things that divide, or big grooves that divide the cerebrum into lobes or hemispheres. The biggest fissure is this one right down the center. That's the longitudinal cerebral fissure. That's where the falx cerebri goes into that. The lateral cerebral fissure is on the side. It divides the temporal lobe, which is down where your ears would be. So right there is the lateral cerebral fissure on the side. The parieto-occipital, none of the models have a nice groove for this. This would be more asked as a question. It separates the parietal lobes from the occipital lobe. So I'll write that down. Parieto-occipital fissure separates the occipital lobe from the parietal lobes. So that one I would ask as a question because there's nothing really to point to. And then the last one is the transverse fissure. And that just separates the cerebellum from the cerebrum. So it's that deep dent. That's where the tentorium cerebelli goes. Look at this little brain, we can see all of those things. The longitudinal cerebral fissure, the one right down the center, the lateral cerebral fissure, right there, separates out the temporal lobe. Parieto occipital is around here, there's no nice little dent, so that'll be a question. And then the transverse, right here. So the lobes, those are easy. I think you probably already know them. frontal lobe in the front, parietal lobes at the top, occipital lobe in the back, temporal lobe by the ears, so that's easy. Okay, now for the next part, I'm gonna do this out of order. I'm gonna draw this out for you. I just think it makes more sense in a different order. So I think it'll go into your brain easier. And then we'll go over it again on the model. So we'll draw a brain from the side. So there's our brain. What we're looking at here are the areas of the cortex. These areas of the cortex, remember the cortex is where you have cell bodies, and cell bodies that have specific jobs are clumped together with cell bodies that are doing kind of similar jobs. So you'll have cell bodies that are responsible for motor movement or motor commands, all kind of grouped together. You'll have cell bodies that are responsible for receiving sense from certain parts of the body all grouped together, for hearing or for smelling, all these different things are all kind of grouped together. So let's also put in the central sulcus here. And then we'll have our frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. So the frontal lobe is all for motor stuff. So this is all efferent stuff going on. And all the others are for sensory of some kind. So remember we saw the precentral sulcus. This is also called the primary motor cortex. So the primary motor, precentral sulcus. Just in front of that is what we call the premotor area. This is something called an association area. Association areas help the primary area, and they're always right next to the primary area. So if you know where the primary area is, just look right around it and you'll find the association area. And then here in the front, you'll have the prefrontal area. So prefrontal at the very tip, then premotor, then the very back of the frontal lobe, you have the primary motor. There's also a piece that has to do only with speaking, so actually moving the muscles of your mouth when you speak. And it's typically only on the left side, and it's kind of a round area. And this is called Broca's area, or motor speech. Okay, now in the parietal lobe, you're going to have the primary sensory, which is the same as the postcentral sulcus. And then right behind that, you'll have the somatic sensory association area. You can just call it sensory association area if you want. I'm fine with behind that, and again in a rounded sort of area, is something called Wernicke's area. Or the general interpretive area. This is where, when you hear things, speech, it makes sense to you. This interprets any speech that you've heard. So words or reading even. Okay, so now we'll move down to the occipital lobe. Right at the very tip of your occipital lobe is primary vision, or the primary visual area. So if you ever get bonked on the back of the head, you see stars, kind of, because you hit those neurons that are responsible for, sensing vision. So if you hit them, they think they saw something. Right around it is the visual association. And that's it for the occipital lobe. In the temporal lobe, you're going to have a big hearing area, so this is the auditory area. And all around it is auditory association. And then there's two more in the temporal lobe. One at the very tip, it's pretty small. This is olfaction. Does everybody know what olfaction means? Smell, exactly. Now gustation, or the gustatory area, they have that kind of on the model, sort of like right here, but it's not exactly accurate. It's actually in that lateral sulcus. So I'm going to just write that separately. So the gustatory area is deep in the lateral sulcus, or fissure, in an area called the insula, which you don't need to know the insula for lab. Probably will need to know it for lecture, so I just put that in parentheses. You don't necessarily need to write that. But I might ask that as a gustatory area. Where is it? It's in the lateral fissure. Okay, so to recap, you've got motor in the front, sensory in the back. So for the motor, you've got the prefrontal area in the very front, premotor area right behind it, and then lastly the primary motor area, which is going to be the red or light pink kind of color on the brain. Also there, you're going to have your motor speech. That's the Broca's area. That's down here. In the parietal lobe, it's all about somatic sensory. You've got the primary sensory area, which will be purple or blue. Right behind it, sensory association area. So association area was right next to the primary. And then lastly, in the parietal lobe, Wernicke's area, right down here. In the occipital lobe, the very tip of the occipital lobe, primary visual association all around it. Temporal lobe, the main part is the auditory area, which makes sense, it's right by your ears, and then auditory association all around it. Olfaction at the very front, gustation all the way deep inside. So everybody know what gustation is? By the way, I don't think I mentioned that. Does anybody know what gustation is? Taste, good. So taste is gustation. So let's just show this to the models, transfer it to the model then. There's just two models where we will use, this is the one you should learn on, because it's got them labeled, so that makes it really easy to learn on it. Make sure you translate it to one that doesn't have it labeled. I'll show you one, and then the one that's the same size as this but doesn't have the pretty colors on it, transfer that also. So here's your frontal lobe. There's the prefrontal area right here. So prefrontal here is premotor, and then primary motor. This one here, where it says motor speech, that's Broca's area. You can call it the motor speech area if you want. Then we hit the central sulcus, and now we're in the parietal lobe. So here's primary sensory, and it says sensory cortex right here. This lighter lavender color is sensory association. There's Wernicke's right behind that. So that's where you interpret language. In the back, the green, that's primary visual. The yellow all around it is visual association. And then in the temporal lobe, auditory, that's the primary area. Auditory association all around it. Here's olfaction, right here is this green, the tip of the temporal lobe, and then gustation is deep in there. So what it would look like on the practical, more like whether it's on the version of this that just doesn't have all the colors on it, or it might be this one, which is a little easier because it's got some more colors on it, just not labeled. Prefrontal, premotor, primary motor, Broca's, primary sensory, sensory association, Wernicke's is back here. All the way in the back, primary visual, there's a little green